In the history of the American Mafia, few bosses were as cunning, ruthless, and resilient as Carmine Persico. Known as the Snake for his ability to slither out of trouble and strike when least expected, Persico rose from the streets of Brooklyn to become boss of the Colombo crime family. He survived multiple assassination attempts, defended himself in court with such skill that he won acquittals against impossible odds, and ruled his crime family from behind prison walls for over 3 decades. He was a throwback to the old mafia, a man who believed in the code, lived by violence, and died in prison at age 85 after spending more than half his life incarcerated. This is the story of Carmine the Snake Persico, the boss who refused to break, cooperate, or surrender, even when it cost him everything. Carmine John Persico Jr. was born on August 8, 1933, in Brooklyn, New York, specifically in the Red Hook neighborhood. Red Hook in the 1930s and 40s was a tough, working-class area dominated by Italian-American immigrants. The neighborhood was controlled by organized crime, and for young men with ambition, but no education or legitimate opportunities, the mafia offered a path to respect and wealth. Carmine grew up surrounded by wise guys, seeing them in social clubs, on street corners, and in his own extended family. The life chose him as much as he chose it. Carmine's family was poor but tight-knit. His father worked on the docks, doing back-breaking labor for modest pay. His mother raised the children in a small apartment where money was always tight. Carmine saw his father work himself to exhaustion for barely enough to survive, and he decided early that he wanted something different. He wasn't going to break his back on the docks like his old man. He was going to be somebody, and in Red Hook, that meant becoming a made man. As a teenager in the late 1940s, Carmine was already running with street gangs. He wasn't the biggest kid or the toughest fighter, but he was smart, fearless, and willing to do whatever it took to earn respect. He got into fights, committed petty crimes, and started building a reputation as someone you didn't mess with. By his late teens, Carmine had caught the attention of the Profaci crime family, one of New York's 5 mafia families. The Profacis controlled rackets throughout Brooklyn, and they were always looking for young, hungry recruits. Carmine's entry into organized crime came through his involvement with a crew of young gangsters who called themselves the Gallo Brothers Gang. Larry, Albert, Crazy Joe, and Joey Gallo were ambitious young criminals who worked for the Profaci family, and Carmine became close associates with them. Together, they carried out robberies, extortions, and enforcement work for the family. Carmine proved himself to be reliable, violent when necessary, and smart enough to avoid getting caught. These qualities would serve him well throughout his criminal career. In the late 1950s, Carmine Persico was formally inducted into the Profaci crime family as a made man. This was the ultimate achievement for a young Italian gangster. Being made meant you are now part of La Cosa Nostra, bound by the code of omertà, and under the protection of the family. You couldn't be killed without permission from the boss, and you had the right to participate in the family's criminal enterprises. For Carmine, becoming a made man at such a young age was validation that he had made the right choice. He was now a somebody. But being made also meant accepting the mafia's hierarchy and rules. You answered to your captain, who answered to the underboss, who answered to the boss. And the boss of the Profaci family was Joe Profaci, an old-school don who demanded absolute loyalty and took a large percentage of his soldiers' earnings. Many members of the family resented Profaci's greed, feeling that he took too much and gave too little back. This resentment would eventually explode into one of the most violent internal wars in mafia history. In 1960, tensions within the Profaci family reached a breaking point. The Gallo brothers, along with other disgruntled members, decided to challenge Joe Profaci's leadership. They kidnapped several of Profaci's top lieutenants and demanded that he share more of the family's wealth and treat the rank-and-file soldiers with more respect. This was an unprecedented act of rebellion within the Mafia, and it triggered what became known as the First Colombo War. Carmine Persico faced a critical choice: side with his friends the Gallo brothers in their rebellion, or remain loyal to boss Joe Profaci. Carmine chose loyalty to Profaci. This decision would define the rest of his life and set him on the path to eventually becoming boss himself. While the Gallos and their supporters went to war against Profaci's loyalists, Carmine became one of Profaci's most trusted soldiers, carrying out hits against the rebels and proving his absolute loyalty to the family leadership. The war was brutal. Over the next several years, numerous mobsters on both sides were killed. Drive-by shootings, ambushes, and executions became regular occurrences in Brooklyn. Carmine participated in multiple murders during this period, solidifying his reputation as a deadly enforcer. His willingness to kill without hesitation earned him the nickname the Snake. He would strike suddenly and without warning, and he was nearly impossible to predict or catch. One of the most famous incidents from this era involved Carmine and a hit on Larry Gallo, one of the Gallo brothers who had rebelled against Profaci. In August 1961, Carmine and other Profaci loyalists lured Larry Gallo to a bar in Brooklyn and attempted to strangle him with a rope. They had him down and were choking the life out of him when a police officer happened to walk into the bar. The officer's presence scared off the hitman, and Larry Gallo survived. Carmine was arrested and charged with attempted murder, but the case fell apart when Larry Gallo, following the code of omertà, refused to testify against him. Carmine walked free, and the legend of the Snake grew. In 1962, Joe Profaci died of natural causes, and his underboss Joe Magliocco took over the family. But Magliocco's leadership was short-lived. In 1963, after Magliocco was caught plotting against other mafia bosses, he was forced to step down. The commission, the ruling body of the American Mafia, composed of the bosses of the 5 families, needed to install new leadership in what was now being called the Colombo family, named after the new boss they selected, Joe Colombo. Joe Colombo was young, charismatic, and forward-thinking, but he wasn't a traditional mobster. He enjoyed publicity, founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League to fight what he called discrimination against Italians, and held massive rallies that attracted tens of thousands of people. Colombo's high profile made the other bosses uncomfortable. The Mafia was supposed to operate in the shadows, not hold press conferences. But Colombo was popular with the rank-and-file members of his family, and for a while, his leadership seemed successful. Carmine Persico thrived under Joe Colombo's leadership. He was promoted to captain, controlling his own crew and overseeing lucrative rackets, including loan sharking, gambling, and labor racketeering. Carmine was making serious money, and he had earned the respect of the entire family. He was known as a man who lived by the old code, who never cooperated with law enforcement, and who would kill to protect the family's interests. These qualities made him valuable and feared in equal measure. But in 1971, Joe Colombo's controversial public life caught up with him. At an Italian-American Unity Day rally in Columbus Circle, a black man named Jerome Johnson approached Colombo and shot him 3 times in the head. Colombo survived, but was left permanently incapacitated, essentially brain dead. Johnson was immediately shot and killed by Colombo's bodyguards, and to this day, the question of who ordered the hit remains debated. Many believe it was Joe Gallo, the last surviving Gallo brother who was still at war with the Colombo family. Others think the commission ordered it because Colombo had become too much of a liability with his public activism. The shooting of Joe Colombo triggered the Second Colombo War, an even more violent conflict than the first. Joe Gallo and his supporters believed they could seize control of the family while Colombo was incapacitated. Carmine Persico and the Colombo loyalists were determined to maintain control. The war exploded into violence across Brooklyn and beyond. On April 7, 1972, Joe Gallo was murdered while celebrating his birthday at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. He was shot multiple times in front of his wife and daughter in a brazen hit that shocked New York. While the shooters were never officially identified, many believe Carmine Persico either ordered or participated in the Gallo hit, finally eliminating his old friend turned enemy. With Joe Gallo dead and Joe Colombo incapacitated, the family needed new leadership. The acting boss position went through several people over the next few years, but by the mid-1970s, it was clear that the real power in the Colombo family was Carmine Persico. In 1973, Carmine was officially recognized as the boss of the Colombo crime family. At just 40 years old, the snake had reached the top of his organization. He now controlled one of the 5 most powerful crime families in America. As boss, Carmine Persico ran a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The Colombo family under his leadership controlled labor unions, ran gambling operations, loan sharking networks, and extortion rackets. They had influence in the construction industry, controlled waste management companies, and had their hands in legitimate businesses across New York. The money flowing into the family was enormous, and Carmine took his cut from all of it. He lived well, owned properties, and enjoyed the respect that came with being a mafia boss. But Carmine's leadership came with constant danger. The mafia in the 1970s was under increasing pressure from law enforcement. The FBI had made organized crime a priority, using wiretaps, surveillance, and aggressive prosecution to target mob bosses. And within the mafia itself, internal politics were treacherous. Bosses were always vulnerable to ambitious underlings or rivals from other families. Carmine survived several assassination attempts during this period, reinforcing his reputation as the snake impossible to kill and always dangerous. Carmine's legal troubles began mounting in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He was arrested multiple times on various charges, including extortion, loan sharking, and racketeering. But Carmine had a secret weapon. He was brilliant in the courtroom. Unlike most mobsters who relied entirely on expensive lawyers, Carmine studied the law himself. He read legal books, learned courtroom procedure, and developed an understanding of criminal law that rivaled many attorneys. He would sometimes represent himself in court, cross-examining witnesses and arguing legal points with a skill that shocked prosecutors and judges. In 1980, Carmine went on trial for federal racketeering charges. The government had a strong case with wiretaps and witness testimony, but Carmine mounted an aggressive defense. He represented himself alongside his lawyer, questioning witnesses, challenging evidence, and presenting legal arguments. The jury was impressed by his intelligence and courtroom presence. Against all odds, Carmine won an acquittal. He had beaten the federal government in a major racketeering case, something that seemed impossible. The snake had slithered out of another trap. But the government wasn't done with Carmine Persico. In the mid-1980s, federal prosecutors developed a new strategy to take down the mafia, the RICO Act. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act allowed prosecutors to charge entire criminal enterprises and hold bosses responsible for crimes committed by their underlings as part of a pattern of racketeering. This was a game changer in the fight against organized crime. In 1985, the federal government launched the Mafia Commission Trial, an unprecedented prosecution targeting the leadership of all 5 New York Mafia families. Carmine Persico was one of the primary defendants, charged alongside bosses and top leaders from the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, and Bonanno families. The charges included murder, extortion, loan sharking, and racketeering. The government's case was built on years of wiretaps, surveillance, and testimony from cooperating witnesses. Carmine once again chose to represent himself, believing his courtroom skills could win another acquittal. He was 52 years old, and this was the fight of his life. The trial lasted from February to November 1986, with Carmine cross-examining witnesses, delivering opening and closing statements, and arguing complex legal issues. His performance was impressive, articulate, intelligent, and surprisingly effective for someone without formal legal training. But this time, the evidence was overwhelming. On November 19, 1986, Carmine Persico and the other defendants were found guilty on all counts. The verdicts represented a massive victory for law enforcement and a devastating blow to the American Mafia. For the first time, the bosses of multiple families had been convicted together in a single trial. The commission trial proved that the Mafia was indeed a coordinated criminal conspiracy, not just independent groups operating separately. Carmine's sentencing came in January 1987. Judge Richard Owens sentenced him to 39 years in federal prison for the racketeering convictions. But the government wasn't finished. In a separate case, Carmine was also convicted of ordering the 1980 murder of William Wild Bill Cutolo, a Colombo family member, though this conviction came much later. Eventually, Carmine's sentences were increased to 100 years in prison. At age 53, Carmine Persico was going to die behind bars. But here's where Carmine Persico's story becomes truly remarkable. Even from prison, he continued to run the Colombo crime family. Using coded messages, intermediaries, and visits from family members and lawyers, Carmine maintained control of his organization for decades. He appointed acting bosses and underbosses to run day-to-day operations, but major decisions still required his approval. The snake was still calling the shots from a prison cell. Maintaining control from prison required cunning and ruthlessness. Carmine had to ensure that his appointed leaders remained loyal and that no one tried to seize power for themselves. He used a combination of respect for his old-school credentials and fear of his ability to order hits from prison. Even incarcerated, Carmine remained dangerous. People who crossed him or tried to take over the family in his absence often ended up dead. The message was clear. Carmine Persico was still the boss, and prison walls wouldn't change that. One of the most significant challenges to Carmine's leadership came in the early 1990s, when a faction within the Colombo family, led by Victor Orena, attempted to take control. Orena had been appointed acting boss by Carmine, but he decided he wanted to be the actual boss. This triggered the Third Colombo War, which lasted from 1991 to 1993. The violence was extreme. Over a dozen people were killed in shootings and ambushes across New York. Carmine, directing strategy from prison, ultimately prevailed. The Orena faction was defeated, and Carmine's loyalists retained control. Even from behind bars, the snake had won another war. Throughout his decades in prison, Carmine Persico never cooperated with law enforcement. Not once. Despite facing 100 years, despite watching other mobsters, including high-ranking ones, become government witnesses to reduce their sentences, Carmine never broke the code of omertà. He remained silent, accepted his fate, and continued to command respect from mobsters who valued the old ways. In an era when cooperation became common, Carmine was a throwback to when made men went to their graves without talking. Carmine's family life was complicated by his incarceration. His son, Alphonse Ali Boy Persico, followed him into the Colombo family and rose to become acting boss under his father's direction. This created a dynasty of sorts, with the Persico name dominating the family for decades. But it also meant that Ali Boy faced the same legal pressures as his father. In 2007, Ali Boy was convicted on racketeering charges and sentenced to life in prison. Like father, like son, both would die behind bars. The Colombo family under Carmine's leadership was known for its internal violence and instability, while families like the Genovese maintained relatively peaceful operations. The Colombos were constantly fighting, either with other families or among themselves. Some of this was due to Carmine's leadership style. He ruled with an iron fist and demanded absolute loyalty, but he was also willing to remove anyone he saw as a threat. This created a culture of paranoia where members never felt completely safe. One of Carmine's most controversial decisions was his involvement in the murder of William Cutolo in 1999. Cutolo was a popular and respected member of the Colombo family who had ambitions to become boss. Carmine, even at 66 years old and having been in prison for over a decade, saw Cutolo as a threat. He ordered Cutolo's murder, which was carried out by loyalists who lured Cutolo to a meeting and killed him. Cutolo's body was hidden, and for years his fate remained unknown. This murder would eventually lead to additional charges and convictions against Carmine and his son. As the years passed and Carmine remained in prison, the world outside changed dramatically. The mafia that Carmine had known was fading. Cooperation with law enforcement became common, with numerous high-ranking mobsters, including bosses and underbosses, testifying against their former associates. The code of omertà that Carmine held sacred was being abandoned by a new generation who chose reduced sentences over honor. The old ways that Carmine represented were dying. But Carmine never adapted or compromised. He remained committed to the traditional mafia values: loyalty to the family above all else, absolute silence when dealing with law enforcement, and the willingness to die in prison rather than become a rat. These values made him a legend among old-school mobsters, but also ensured he would never see freedom again. Carmine chose honor over freedom, and he paid the price. In his later years, Carmine's health began to decline. Decades of incarceration took their toll. He developed various medical issues, and by his 70s, he was an old man still serving a sentence that would keep him imprisoned for the rest of his life. There were occasional rumors of compassionate release due to his age and health, but the government opposed any such move. Carmine Persico had been a violent criminal for over 50 years, ordered numerous murders, and run a crime family from prison. He would die behind bars. On March 7, 2019, Carmine Persico died at the Federal Medical Center in Durham, North Carolina. He was 85 years old and had spent the last 33 years of his life in federal prison. His death marked the end of an era. Carmine was one of the last old-school mafia bosses who had lived by the traditional code and refused to break it no matter the cost. His entire life had been dedicated to La Cosa Nostra, and he died, as he lived, a made man who never cooperated. The reaction to Carmine's death was mixed. Law enforcement officials noted his long criminal career and the violence he had ordered. He was responsible for numerous murders, had run a major criminal organization, and had caused immeasurable harm. They viewed his death as the end of a dangerous criminal's life. But in certain circles, particularly among old-school mobsters and those who valued the traditional mafia code, Carmine was respected as one of the last true bosses who never broke omertà. Carmine Persico's legacy is complicated. He was a ruthless criminal who ordered murders, ran extortion rackets, and profited from illegal enterprises for decades. He caused suffering through his actions and the actions of his criminal organization. The violence associated with the Colombo family under his leadership left numerous victims murdered mobsters, terrorized business owners, and families destroyed by the loss of loved ones. But Carmine was also a symbol of a dying breed, the old mafia that operated by a code and valued loyalty above survival. In an era when cooperation became the norm, when bosses testified against their own families to reduce sentences, Carmine stood as a reminder of what the mafia once claimed to be, an organization where made men went to their graves in silence. Whether that code was worth dying in prison for is a question each person must answer for themselves. Carmine's intelligence and courtroom skills were legendary. His 1980 acquittal, where he defended himself and won against federal racketeering charges, remains one of the most impressive legal victories in organized crime history. His performance in the commission trial, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated a sharp legal mind that could have succeeded in legitimate pursuits had he chosen a different path. This makes his story even more tragic. A brilliant man who used his intelligence in service of crime. The nickname "the Snake" perfectly captured Carmine's nature. He was patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. He was dangerous and unpredictable. He slithered out of legal troubles that would have destroyed others. And he struck his enemies suddenly and fatally. The Snake was a predator who survived in the deadly world of organized crime for over 50 years. An achievement in itself, given the violence and law enforcement pressure that destroyed so many others. Carmine's control of the Colombo family from prison for 3 decades is perhaps his most remarkable achievement from a criminal perspective. Most bosses lose control of their families within years of incarceration, as ambitious underlings seize the opportunity to take over. Carmine maintained his grip through force of personality, strategic thinking, and ruthless elimination of threats. This required incredible skill in managing people, maintaining loyalty, and projecting power even from behind prison walls. The Persico family's control of the Colombo crime family created a dynasty that lasted decades. Carmine ruled from 1973 until his death in 2019, 46 years, though the last 33 were from prison. His son Alphonse continued the family's leadership, though he too ended up with a life sentence. The Persico name became synonymous with the Colombo family, a rare example of generational control in the modern mafia. Today, the Colombo crime family still exists, though in greatly diminished form. The RICO prosecutions, the wave of cooperating witnesses, and the death of old-school leaders like Carmine have severely weakened all 5 New York families. The Colombo family has struggled with leadership instability and internal conflicts. The era of powerful, long-serving bosses like Carmine Persico is over. The mafia persists, but it's a shadow of what it was during Carmine's prime. Carmine Persico spent approximately 33 years behind bars out of his 85-year life. That's nearly 40% of his entire existence, confined to a cell, cut off from freedom, family, and the world. He chose this fate by refusing to cooperate, by maintaining his commitment to omertà, and by continuing to run a criminal organization even from prison. Whether this represents admirable loyalty or tragic stubbornness depends on your perspective. In the pantheon of American Mafia bosses, Carmine Persico occupies a unique position. He wasn't as powerful as Carlo Gambino, as wealthy as Paul Castellano, or as famous as John Gotti. But he was perhaps the last true believer in the Mafia code. A boss who ruled for decades, survived multiple wars, defended himself in court, ran his family from prison, and died without ever becoming a government witness. For that, he earned a place in Mafia history as one of the last of his kind. The story of Carmine, the Snake Persico, is ultimately about choices and their consequences. He chose the criminal life over legitimate opportunities. He chose loyalty to Joe Profaci over friendship with the gallows. He chose to become boss and accept all the dangers that came with it. He chose to represent himself in court. He chose to maintain control from prison rather than stepping down. And he chose never to cooperate, accepting that he would die behind bars. Every choice led inevitably to the next, creating a path that ended in a prison hospital at age 85. His life raises questions about the Mafia code itself. Was Carmine's refusal to cooperate admirable loyalty or foolish stubbornness? Did his adherence to omertà demonstrate honor or simply enable more violence and crime? Is there nobility in dying in prison for a criminal organization? Or is it just a waste of a life? These questions have no easy answers, but they're worth considering when examining Carmine's legacy. What cannot be disputed is that Carmine Persico was a formidable figure who shaped organized crime in New York for half a century. He survived when many others didn't. He led when others followed. He fought when others surrendered. And he remained silent when everyone else was talking. The snake lived by the old code, and he died by it too, never breaking, never cooperating, never surrendering. In the end, that was both his greatest strength and his ultimate tragedy. Carmine Persico was born on August 8, 1933, in Brooklyn, New York, and died on March 7, 2019, in Durham, North Carolina, at age 85. He was boss of the Colombo crime family from 1973 until his death, ruling for 46 years, 33 of them from federal prison. He was sentenced to 100 years and never cooperated with law enforcement. He died in federal custody, one of the last old-school mafia bosses who lived and died by the code of omertà.